In the long history of human invention, progress almost always moves in one direction. We begin with the crude and the simple, and through centuries of failure, we refine our way toward the complex. The Wright brothers' first flight did not travel faster than a modern jet. The first computer was not more powerful than the phone in your pocket. Mastery is a slow accumulation of knowledge, a ladder climbed one generational rung at a time. But on the Giza Plateau, the timeline of engineering seems to break this fundamental rule. The Great Pyramid, attributed to Khufu in the 4th dynasty, is the largest, the most precise, and the most structurally sound. It is an act of perfection that appears suddenly in the archaeological record, and yet the pyramids that were built after it, those from the 5th and 6th dynasties, did not improve on its design. They did not even equal it. They became smaller. They were built with softer stones and loose rubble, while the Great Pyramid still stands largely intact after 4,500 years. The pyramids of the later pharaohs have crumbled into shapeless mounds of debris. This is not how technology usually works. Civilizations do not typically forget their greatest achievements while they are still at the height of their power. We are left with a quiet, uncomfortable contradiction. The oldest structure is the most advanced, and everything that followed was a slow decline into imitation. It forces us to ask whether the builders of the 4th dynasty were inventing a new technology, or if they were the last inheritors of a knowledge that was already fading away. For those of you listening in the quiet hours, perhaps watching the shadows lengthen across your room, welcome to a space where we can let these questions breathe. Tonight we are not looking for the loud answers of history, but for the whispers that survive in the stone. If you enjoy this slower pace of discovery, I invite you to join us for what lies ahead. The standard story tells us that the Great Pyramid was the climax of a rapid architectural evolution. We are told that Egypt moved from mud brick mounds to the step pyramid, and then, in a flash of brilliance, to the perfection of Giza. But the physical evidence on the plateau suggests a capability that goes beyond simple architectural progression. It suggests a mastery of physics, geology, and mathematics that does not fit neatly into the timeline we have been given. To understand why, we have to look closely at what was actually built. We have to look at the precision of the alignment, which rivals modern optical engineering. We have to look at the scale of the stones, some weighing as much as a locomotive, lifted to heights that would challenge a modern crane. And we have to look at the silence, because for a civilization that obsessively recorded its taxes, its wars, and its religious rituals, there is a strange void when it comes to the Great Pyramid. We have found the workers' lists. We have found the daily logs of limestone deliveries. But we have never found the blueprints. There are no engineering manuals explaining how the internal chambers were calculated. There are no texts describing how the architects solved the problem of the Grand Gallery's corbelled ceiling. It is as if the most difficult engineering feat in human history was achieved without anyone writing down the theory behind it. Or perhaps the theory was written down, but not by the people we think. What we are left with is a monument that refuses to fit comfortably into the era it is assigned to. It stands too perfectly, too early. And as we peel back the layers of accepted history, we find that the Egyptians themselves rarely claimed to have built it. In their later texts, they often spoke of the plateau as a place of ancestors and gods, a legacy they were protecting, not creating. Tonight we will walk the perimeter of that legacy and ask what happens when the stones tell a different story than the textbooks. The first thing to notice, if you stand in the mind on the edge of the Giza plateau, is that the Great Pyramid is not alone. It is surrounded by other pyramids, other temples, causeways, mastabas, and fields of stone that suggest a long and confident tradition of building. And yet, when the gaze moves forward in time, away from Khufu and toward the kings who came after, something begins to thin, as if the thread of certainty is quietly fraying. In later generations, pyramids still rise in Egypt, but many are built with a different kind of ambition. Some are smaller, some rely on rougher core masonry, some have outer casing that once made them gleam, but the bodies beneath seem less permanent, less patient, as if speed began to matter more than endurance. The impression is not that Egypt stopped building, but that it stopped building in quite the same way. It is tempting, at this point, to reach for a simple explanation. Perhaps the Great Pyramid was just too expensive, too labour-intensive, too hungry for resources, and the state made a practical decision to scale back. That is certainly part of the scholarly discussion. The vast cost and logistical effort of pyramid building is often weighed against the changing needs of the kingdom. But even a practical explanation leaves a quieter question behind. A civilization can decide not to repeat a costly project, but why would it lose the ability to repeat it? Why would the later pyramids not merely be smaller copies, but in many cases less precise and less durable? If the knowledge remained intact, it should still be visible, even in reduced scale. And then there is the question of the records. Egypt, in the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, was not a culture that ignored paperwork. It counted, it catalogued, it named officials and documented shipments. It left behind the feeling of an administrative mind, a mind that believed order itself was sacred. So when the Great Pyramid stands there without an obvious written manual beside it, the silence feels less like an accident and more like a shape that needs to be explained. In recent years, one discovery has often been offered as a bridge across that silence. The so-called Diary of Mera, a set of papyri from Wadi al-Jarf that records a work crew transporting limestone on the Nile and canals in service of Khufu's building projects. The reason it matters is simple. It is among the oldest papyrus documents ever found, and it speaks in the plain voice of daily logistics rather than myth or royal boasting. And yet, if you read what is commonly summarised from it, another tension appears. The diary is valuable, but it is not a blueprint. It speaks of moving stone, of days and journeys, of administration, rather than the kind of geometric and structural decision-making that would explain how a pyramid's internal design was conceived. It can tell you that material was moved, and it can help anchor the project in its historical context, but it does not describe the full architecture of the feat. That difference matters because it changes the kind of question we should be asking. If the diary is real evidence of organised labour and transport, then one mystery is answered. But it also sharpens another. If the state could record the routine details of hauling stone, why is there no equivalent record of the underlying engineering logic? It is possible, of course, that such texts existed and were lost. Papyrus decays, archives burn, royal libraries disappear. Whole centuries can fall into gaps where only fragments survive. That is a sober and sensible answer, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But it still leaves a faint discomfort, because what survives in Egypt is not only papyrus. There are inscriptions carved into stone, meant to endure. There are ritual texts meant to outlast the body. If the Great Pyramid represented a crowning achievement, why does the surviving record feel tilted toward ritual and administration and away from explanation? Perhaps that is the first assumption to gently set aside. The assumption that explanation was expected to be written down at all. Perhaps the engineering knowledge lives somewhere else, within a craft tradition, transmitted through apprenticeship and demonstration rather than through formal treatises. Perhaps the architect's mind was not a scribal mind, and the people who could calculate the line of a corridor or the angle of a ramp were not the people responsible for preserving words. If that were true, the Great Pyramid becomes something like an artifact of a living practice rather than a literary tradition. And living practices can fade quietly. They can be disrupted by politics, by changes in patronage, by the death of a small group of specialists. They can be lost without leaving a clear line of text that says, this is where it ended. Even this, though, does not fully account for the precision that stares back at us from the Great Pyramid's geometry. One of the most frequently discussed features is its near-cardinal alignment, how closely its sides face north, south, east, and west. The idea itself is not mysterious. Many cultures oriented sacred buildings to the sky, but the degree of accuracy suggested by modern surveys is what makes the mind pause. Aligning a building to true north is not the same as pointing toward a convenient landmark. True north is astronomical. It does not announce itself on the ground. It must be found through observation, measurement, and patient correction. Discussions of the pyramid's alignment often turn to sky-based methods, observing circumpolar stars, using their motion to find the celestial pole, and translating that into a line on the Earth. Some popular explanations have even suggested that seasonal moments, like the equinox, could have helped provide a reliable observational reference, by making certain solar patterns more predictable for a careful observer. Whether that specific idea holds in every detail is debated in the public conversation, but the broader point remains. The sky is the most stable compass available to a world without magnetic instruments. And the moment the sky enters the conversation, a second, softer contradiction arrives. Because ancient Egypt is often described in schoolbook terms as an agrarian kingdom, organising itself around predictable cycles of flooding and harvest. It was that, certainly, but the level of observational patience implied by precise astronomical alignment suggests a culture that watched the night carefully and repeatedly, not merely to tell stories, but to measure. This is where the documentary mind has to slow down and become careful. The Great Pyramid's proportions have been argued over for generations, and some interpretations claim mathematical constants are encoded in the structure. Claims about deliberate incorporation of values like pi are often met with skepticism, and many scholars and historians caution that apparent numerical relationships can emerge from practical design choices and later measurement practices. In other words, it is possible to discover a pattern without proving intention, but skepticism does not remove the fascination. In fact, it refines it, because even if certain numerical claims are coincidence, the pyramid still required an ability to hold lines straight over long distances, to keep corners true, to maintain consistent angles, to coordinate enormous labour and material flows over years. Those are not romantic mysteries. They are technical ones. They are mysteries of competence. And competence has a habit of leaving traces. It leaves behind a trail of simpler versions, prototypes, failed attempts that show the mind learning in public. Egypt does have earlier pyramids, earlier experiments, and visible evolution leading up to the fourth dynasty, but the Great Pyramid remains, in many discussions, a peak that feels strangely isolated by its scale and finish. So perhaps the better question is not whether Egyptians built it. The evidence supports that it belongs to their old kingdom world, and logistical documents like Mera's diary tie major building activity to Khufu's reign. The more delicate question is what built truly means in a civilization where knowledge could be inherited, guarded, specialised, or unevenly distributed. If a small cadre of master builders, engineers in all but name, held the core methods, then the knowledge could vanish in a single generation without leaving a public collapse. The state would continue. The rituals would continue. The pyramids would continue. But the invisible precision would begin to soften. And when knowledge softens, the culture often compensates with story, not necessarily with deceit, but with meaning. What cannot be reconstructed in practice becomes preserved in reverence. What cannot be rebuilt becomes protected. In that way, a society can become the caretaker of its own earlier genius without fully possessing it. This idea fits uncomfortably well with another broad historical shift, the eventual decline of pyramid building as a royal strategy as later rulers turned to other forms of burial and security, partly because pyramids were conspicuous and vulnerable to looting, and partly because religious ideas and political realities changed over time. Those later shifts do not explain everything about the fourth dynasty, but they do show that the pyramid was never just an engineering project. It was a political and spiritual statement, and statements change when the world changes. Yet for now, the Great Pyramid remains, and it continues to ask its quiet question from the plateau. If the Egyptians of Khufu's reign could organise the transport of stone so efficiently that a foreman could log it in tidy daily notes, then the state had memory. If the pyramid could be aligned with such extraordinary confidence to the cardinal directions through sky-based observation, then the builders had measurement. And if later generations built in a way that seems less exact, then some fragile human element, shifted out of place. In the next stretch of this story, the focus will narrow further, away from the surface and toward the inner design, the corridors, the strange changes of angle, the chambers that do not sit where one might expect, and the feeling that parts of the pyramid were planned with a mind that kept secrets even from the people who hauled the stone, because a structure can be silent in words and still be talkative in form. And the Great Pyramid, when listened to patiently, does not sound like a simple monument. It sounds like a solution to a problem that has not yet been clearly stated. If you were to approach the Great Pyramid as a visitor in the ancient world, long after its construction, you would find the outer surface smooth and reflective, clad in polished Tura limestone. The entrances would not be obvious. There would be no grand doorway inviting you inside. The pyramid was not designed to be entered. It was designed to remain sealed, locked against time and intrusion, a permanent enclosure around something hidden. And yet, despite that intention, people did eventually go inside, not immediately and not easily. The original entrance, when finally located, was high on the north face, deliberately placed above ground level and concealed beneath casing stones. What lies beyond that entrance is not a simple corridor leading to a single burial chamber. It is a network of passages that change direction, shift in size, and include features that do not appear in earlier or later pyramids. The internal design of the Great Pyramid is not symmetrical, it is not intuitive, and in several places it seems to solve problems that should not have existed in the first place. Unless the builders were working within constraints we do not fully understand. The first passage descends steeply into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It angles downward at roughly 26 degrees, carved through solid limestone, leading to an unfinished chamber far below the base. This subterranean chamber is rough, chaotic in appearance, and shows signs of incomplete work. Some have interpreted it as an abandoned plan, a starting point that was discarded when the design changed. Others suggest it may have served a symbolic or ritual function that did not require finish. But then, partway down that descending corridor, another passage branches upward. This ascending corridor climbs at nearly the same angle as the descending one, but in reverse, rising into the body of the pyramid itself. It is narrow, low, and continues for a significant distance before opening suddenly into a space that defies the surrounding architecture, the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is not a room, it is a corridor, but one built at a scale and with a structural ambition that seems out of proportion to its function. It rises nearly 9 metres high, with walls that corbel inward in 7-stepped layers, creating a ceiling that narrows as it climbs. The corbelling technique distributes weight outward, reducing pressure on the passage below, but the height and precision suggest a purpose beyond simple access. At the top of the Grand Gallery lies the King's Chamber, a rectangular room built entirely from red granite blocks, some weighing as much as 70 tons. The chamber contains a granite sarcophagus, undecorated and unfinished, positioned in a way that suggests it was placed during construction rather than moved in afterward. Above the chamber, 5 separate compartments were built, each capped with massive granite beams, and the topmost one with a peaked roof. These are called relieving chambers, and their purpose, according to most interpretations, was to prevent the immense weight of the pyramid above from crushing the king's chamber. But if that is their only purpose, the design raises a question. Why 5 layers? Why not 3, or 2, or 1? And why use such enormous stones when lighter corbelling techniques, already employed elsewhere in the structure, might have achieved the same structural goal with less material and less labour? There is also the matter of the so-called Queen's Chamber, located lower in the pyramid along a horizontal passage branching off the ascending corridor. It is smaller than the King's Chamber and built from limestone rather than granite. Its function is unclear. It contains no sarcophagus. Its name is a later invention, not based on any Egyptian inscription. Some have suggested it was an earlier burial plan, later abandoned. Others propose it had a ritual or symbolic role tied to the pyramid's broader cosmology. What links these spaces is not narrative, but geometry. The passages align with precision. The chambers are positioned with care. The angles are consistent across long distances. And yet, there is no known Egyptian text that explains why these specific choices were made, or what problem each feature was designed to solve. This is where the silence becomes architectural. It is not that the Egyptians left no record of pyramid building at all. There are references to pyramids in funerary texts. There are inscriptions naming kings and linking them to their monuments. There are later Greek and Roman accounts describing the pyramids as wonders. But there is no surviving document that reads like an engineering manual. No text that says, this is how the Grand Gallery was calculated, and this is why the relieving chambers were stacked in this specific way. In a culture that documented grain shipments, tax collections, and the movements of labour crews, the absence of such a text is not neutral. It suggests either that the knowledge was never written, or that it was written and lost, or that it was transmitted through a different system entirely, one that did not rely on scribal record-keeping. If the knowledge was oral, passed from master builder to apprentice through demonstration and physical training, then it would be fragile. It would survive only as long as the tradition remained unbroken. A single generation of disruption, political upheaval, economic collapse, or the death of key specialists could sever the chain. And once severed, the knowledge would not simply pause. It would begin to distort as later builders tried to recreate what they remembered seeing without fully understanding the principles behind it. This is one possible explanation for why later pyramids, though still monumental, lack the internal sophistication of the Great Pyramid. They approximate the form. They honour the tradition, but they do not replicate the precision because the underlying logic has already begun to fade. Another explanation, quieter and more speculative, is that the Great Pyramid was not the beginning of a tradition, but the end of one. that it represents the final expression of a body of knowledge that had been developing for much longer than the conventional timeline allows, and that the fourth dynasty builders were not inventors, but preservers of something already mature. This idea does not sit comfortably within mainstream archaeology, and for good reason. It requires evidence that does not yet exist in clear form. It asks us to imagine a pre-dynastic or early dynastic Egypt with access to geometric and astronomical knowledge that predates the written record, knowledge that was later institutionalized, ritualized, and eventually misunderstood by the very culture that inherited it. But the idea is not entirely without texture. There are hints, scattered and ambiguous, that the Egyptians themselves did not always claim to be the originators of their most sacred sites. In some later period inscriptions, the plateau at Giza is described in ways that suggest antiquity, even to the writers of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after Khufu. One such inscription is the inventory stele, a granite slab found near the Great Pyramid and attributed to the 26th dynasty, though its dating and authenticity have been debated. The text claims that the Sphinx already existed during Khufu's reign, and that Khufu built his pyramid near it, rather than commissioning the Sphinx as part of his project. It also mentions a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis, said to have been present before the pyramid was constructed. Mainstream Egyptology generally regards the inventory stele as a later fabrication, a product of the 26th dynasty's well-documented tendency to revive and romanticize Egypt's distant past. The language, style, and historical context of the stele do not align with Old Kingdom inscriptions, and there is no corroborating evidence from Khufu's time that supports its claims. And yet, the existence of the stele itself is curious. Why would later Egyptians feel the need to invent such a story? What purpose did it serve to claim that the Sphinx and the temples predated Khufu, rather than attributing everything to his glory? If the goal was propaganda, it would make more sense to credit Khufu with more construction, not less. One possibility is that the stele reflects a persistent cultural memory, perhaps distorted or misunderstood, of an older sacred landscape that existed before the pyramids. Not necessarily an older civilization in the dramatic sense, but an older phase of Egyptian religious life, one that saw the Giza plateau as already significant before it became a royal necropolis. This would not overturn the evidence linking Khufu to the Great Pyramid. It would simply add another layer, suggesting that the choice of location was not arbitrary, that Khufu may have been building within a landscape already charged with meaning, already oriented in ways that constrained or guided his architects. If that were true, it would explain why the pyramid's alignment and positioning feel so deliberate. Why? The site was chosen despite the logistical challenges of transporting millions of tons of stone to an elevated plateau. It would suggest that the pyramid was not just a tomb, but a response to something already present, something the builders wanted to honour, enclose, or complete. But without clearer evidence, this remains speculative. What is not speculative is the strangeness of the internal design. The chambers and corridors of the Great Pyramid do not behave like a simple burial structure. They behave like a mechanism, as if each feature serves a purpose that goes beyond enclosing a body. Some have suggested the relieving chambers above the king's chamber were designed not only for structural support, but to create resonance, turning the space into a kind of acoustic chamber. The granite walls, if struck, produce a clear tone. Whether this was intentional or incidental is unknown, but it adds to the feeling that the pyramid's interior was designed with care that exceeds the minimum requirements of a tomb. Others have pointed to the narrow shafts that extend from both the king's and queen's chambers, angling upward through the masonry toward the outer face of the pyramid. These shafts were once thought to be air shafts, though that term is misleading. They are too small for human passage and were originally sealed at both ends. Modern exploration has revealed that they extend for significant distances, maintaining precise angles, and in some cases terminating in small copper fittings or stone plugs. Their purpose is unknown. Some have proposed they had astronomical significance, aligning with specific stars at the time of construction. Others suggest they served a ritual function tied to the pharaoh's journey in the afterlife. Still others argue they are structural features, designed to relieve internal pressure in ways we do not yet understand. What links all these interpretations is uncertainty. The pyramid's interior does not announce its logic, it withholds. And in that withholding, it creates a space for questions that have no easy resolution. If the builders intended the pyramid to remain sealed forever, why did they include passages that lead nowhere? If the subterranean chamber was abandoned, why was it left partially finished rather than completely filled or ignored? If the Grand Gallery was purely functional, why build it at such extraordinary scale? These are not questions that demand supernatural answers. They are questions that ask us to reconsider what functional might have meant to a civilization whose architecture was never purely practical, whose monuments were always layered with meaning, and whose concept of a tomb was inseparable from cosmology, ritual, and the preservation of order itself. The Great Pyramid may have been a tomb, but it may also have been something else: a calendar, a map, a teaching tool, a boundary marker between one kind of knowledge and another. Not all of these possibilities can be true, but the structure itself does not choose among them. It remains deliberately, stubbornly ambiguous. And that ambiguity is not a flaw. It may be the design, because a structure that can only be understood one way becomes fixed, explained, and eventually ignored. But a structure that invites multiple interpretations remains active in the mind. It continues to generate questions. It refuses to be finished. The Great Pyramid, in that sense, is still under construction, not in stone, but in thought. And as we move deeper into its timeline, into the centuries after Khufu, we will see how later Egyptians responded to that unfinished quality, how they tried to honour it, replicate it, and eventually how they began to speak of it not as something they built, but as something they inherited. For a moment, let the mind stay with that word that keeps returning, even when it is not spoken aloud: silence. It is easy to think of silence as emptiness, as a lack. But some silences are built, some are engineered. And the Great Pyramid's silence is not the quiet of neglect. It is the quiet of something that was meant to endure without explanation. The papyri associated with Merer, for example, speak in a practical voice about moving limestone and organising work in Khufu's time. They are valuable precisely because they do not feel like myth. They feel like the normal machinery of a state that knew how to supply a massive project. And that normality makes a listener wonder very gently why the most normal kind of document was preserved, while the most essential kind of document, an explanation of design, seems to be missing. It could be loss, it could be accident, it could be the simple fact that papyrus is perishable and archives do not always survive. But there is another possibility that does not require a missing library. It requires only a different way of thinking about expertise. In many societies, the people who build are not the people who write. The people who calculate in their heads do not always set those calculations into ink. Knowledge can live in the body, in the hand, in the sequence of movements that produce a straight line or a true angle. When knowledge lives there, it can be transmitted with astonishing fidelity for centuries, and then vanish quickly, like a song lost when the last singer dies. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply the nature of crafts. And if the Great Pyramid was the product of such a craft tradition, then the structure becomes less like a project and more like a culmination, a final perfected expression of a method that had reached its peak. After that, the method might still exist, but slightly altered, slightly rushed, slightly weakened by changes no later historian would easily see. This is where the later decline in pyramid building becomes more than a footnote. Over time, pharaohs stopped building pyramids as their primary royal tombs, and discussions of why often include practical concerns like cost and labour, the vulnerability of pyramids to looting, and changing religious and political priorities. That shift is usually described as gradual, not sudden, but even a gradual shift can have sharp consequences for specialist knowledge. When patronage changes, expertise migrates or disappears. When a state stops demanding a certain kind of precision, the people capable of it no longer have a reason to train successors. And this leads to a quiet question that is easy to overlook. If a pyramid was meant to protect a king, why build something so visible that it announces its presence to the horizon? If security was the goal, the pyramid seems almost like a paradox, both fortress and invitation. And if symbolism was the goal, then perhaps the king was trying to accomplish something that mattered more than physical security. That kind of question has a way of turning the mind inward, toward what the structure might have been trying to do. Many discussions of the Great Pyramid's orientation emphasize that it is very closely aligned to the cardinal directions, and that achieving such alignment likely required careful astronomical observation rather than any simple ground-based marker. That does not prove a single definitive method, and there are multiple proposals about how the builders could have found true north with high accuracy. But the underlying idea remains steady. The sky is stable enough to become a measuring instrument when the ground is not. And the moment the sky becomes part of the engineering, the pyramid begins to feel less like a tomb and more like a statement about order, because a tomb can be built anywhere. But a structure that insists on a specific alignment is making a claim. It is anchoring itself to something beyond the human landscape. It is saying, this is not merely a building placed on earth. This is a geometry placed into the world. Yet even here, the pyramid refuses to give a clean answer. A listener might expect that if the structure was about the heavens, then its internal spaces would be obvious instruments, clear and readable, like a sundial. Instead, the interior seems to hide its logic. It offers corridors that angle and shift. It offers chambers whose purposes remain debated. It offers a design that feels even now as though it is withholding something. And withholding, strangely, is a kind of communication. Consider how the story of the pyramid changes when it is told from the perspective of later Egyptians. By the time centuries had passed, the Great Pyramid was already ancient, already wrapped in reverence and distance. And as with many revered objects, the older it becomes, the more it invites stories that fill the gaps where documentation fails. Not because people are lying, but because humans cannot bear a sacred emptiness. We reach for meaning the way a hand reaches for warmth. This is why later explanations matter, even when they are unreliable as direct historical evidence. They show what the monument became in cultural memory, and cultural memory often reveals what a society needed the monument to be. There is also an uncomfortable practical reality that begins to creep into the story. Looting. A pyramid is monumental, but it is not a perfect safe. Its passageways can be breached. Its stones can be pried, its entrances can be rediscovered. And discussions of why pyramid building eventually declined commonly include the fact that pyramids were conspicuous targets and many were robbed, pushing later rulers toward different burial strategies. If that is true, then the Great Pyramid's very existence becomes a kind of gamble. It suggests that what was being pursued was worth the risk of future intrusion. But then comes another small, unsettling question. If the Great Pyramid was built to protect a burial, and if it was later entered, then what exactly was found? The king's chamber contains a granite sarcophagus. That is often the first detail that anchors the imagination, because it feels like the one unmistakable sign of a tomb. But the chamber itself offers no decorated walls, no inscribed narrative of the king's journey, no clear, comforting evidence that the king's body remained there undisturbed. And the absence is not a proof of anything exotic. Absence can be explained by robbery, by time, by the stripping of materials. But psychologically, absence does something powerful. It creates space. It opens a gap that the mind cannot help walking into. If looters took everything, then the pyramid is a violated tomb, and the story is tragic but ordinary. If looters did not take everything, then one must ask what could have been removed so completely that even certainty vanished. And if one allows the thought to drift a little further, another possibility appears, not as a claim, but as a question. What if the pyramid was never primarily meant to hold a body? That question must be held delicately because the mainstream understanding links these monuments to royal burial practices, and there is real evidence of pyramids as tombs in Egypt's broader tradition. It would be irresponsible to announce with confidence that the Great Pyramid was something else entirely. But the mind can still ask why its internal plan feels unusually elaborate compared to what a simple burial might require, and why it seems designed to confuse, redirect, and mislead. A trap does not have to be mechanical. A trap can be conceptual. A corridor that splits the design into multiple routes can be a kind of security. A chamber left unfinished can be a decoy, a placeholder for those who believe the first thing they find must be the true destination. The pyramid might be using architecture as misdirection, not only against thieves, but against anyone who tries to reduce it to a single function. And this is where the earlier point about craft knowledge begins to take on a more haunting shape. If the internal design was crafted by specialists whose knowledge was partly oral, partly embodied, then the pyramid becomes one of the few places where that knowledge might still be stored, even after the people themselves are gone, not stored in words, but in decisions, in angles, in the way weight is redirected, in the way a passage narrows at the precise moment it needs to control movement. The structure becomes a fossilized intelligence. Yet a fossil does not tell you the whole animal. It offers fragments, and the mind must reconstruct the rest. This reconstruction is where modern observers often become vulnerable to overreach. When a monument is as large and emotionally charged as the Great Pyramid, it becomes a magnet for certainty. People want a single explanation that will make the strangeness settle into place. Some explanations lean heavily into mathematics. Some lean into astronomy. Some lean into symbolism. And some lean into the tempting claim that the pyramid's creators possessed knowledge out of place for their era. A careful approach holds all of these as possibilities in varying degrees, while refusing to turn any one of them into a final key. Discussions of the pyramid's astronomical alignment, for instance, can be grounded in plausible observational methods without implying modern technology. The sky itself can provide astonishing precision if watched patiently enough, and the administrative capacity implied by logbooks like Mera's diary supports the idea that Old Kingdom Egypt could coordinate immense labour and resource flows. But when these facts sit side by side, they raise another subtle tension. A state can coordinate labour. A state can worship the heavens. A state can build monuments. And yet the pyramid still gives the impression of an internal mind, an intelligence in the plan, that feels unusually concentrated, as if the whole design emerged from a small number of decisions made early, decisions that were then executed with disciplines over years. This concentration is hard to prove, but easy to feel, and the feeling itself becomes part of the experience that keeps listeners awake, even as the pace remains calm. The mind senses intention, and intention invites motive. So the question becomes, what motive could be powerful enough to justify the Great Pyramid's scale, its precision, and its silence? If it was meant as a stairway to the sky, the silence makes sense. The sky does not explain itself. It simply is. If it was meant as a machine of ritual, something that enacted a transformation, then silence also makes sense. Ritual is often protected by secrecy, not because it is fraudulent, but because its power depends on controlled knowledge. And if it was meant to be a political statement, a demonstration of centralized authority, then silence again becomes useful. A king does not need to explain his power. He needs only to show it. Each of these motives feels plausible in isolation. The discomfort comes from trying to choose only one, because the Great Pyramid does not feel like a single-purpose object. It feels layered, like something built for multiple audiences at once, for the living who saw it gleam on the horizon, for the priests who understood its sacred geography, for the workers whose days were measured in stone shipments, and perhaps for a future no one could fully imagine. And here the story narrows again, as promised, away from the broad plateau and toward a smaller, stranger detail. A monument can be built to be seen, but the Great Pyramid also contains features that were not built to be seen by crowds. They were built to be hidden inside the body of the stone. They were built to remain unknown unless someone entered, unless someone measured, unless someone searched, which raises the quietest question of all. Why would builders create inner features that only a future intruder could ever truly notice? That question does not accuse, it does not claim conspiracy, it simply observes a tension between sealed forever and structured with internal precision that invites discovery. In the next segment, attention will move toward those subtle internal features that seem least compatible with the idea of a simple sealed tomb, and most compatible with the idea of a message embedded in stone, features that might not explain the pyramid, but might reveal the kind of mind that designed it. And if that mind was trying to leave something behind, the most important part may not be what it tells us. It may be what it refuses to tell us. There is a particular kind of mystery that does not come from what a monument hides, but from what it insists on showing. The Great Pyramid is not only large, it is also oriented in a way that seems to care about the planet itself, as if the builders were trying to lock the structure into the geometry of the Earth, rather than simply place it on the ground. When people say the pyramid is aligned to north, the phrase sounds simple, almost casual. But north is not a point you can touch. True north is not the direction a needle would point, and it is not the direction a traveller might guess by instinct. True north is an invisible line tied to the Earth's axis, and finding it reliably requires watching the sky with patience. That difference between magnetic and true north often slips past the mind at first, because modern life makes it feel irrelevant. But in the ancient world, it changes everything. A culture can orient buildings by local landmarks, by river flow, by sunrise, by ritual convenience. Yet if a structure aims for cardinal precision, it implies repeated observation, correction, and a willingness to wait until the sky confirms what the ground cannot. This is where the calm becomes sharper, not softer, because it raises a quiet question that refuses to settle. Why would the builders of a tomb, even a royal tomb, need that kind of precision at all? One answer is religious. Egyptian kingship was tied to cosmic order, and aligning a monument could be a way of aligning a reign, making stone participate in the same stability that the heavens seem to embody. That explanation is reasonable, and it stays within what is known about how ancient cultures often merged architecture with cosmology. But then the mind steps forward again, just one pace. If the alignment mattered religiously, was it meant to be close enough? Or did it need to be almost exact? And if almost exact was enough, why does the Great Pyramid still give the impression of pushing beyond enough towards something more disciplined, more technical? Some proposed methods for achieving this kind of accuracy focus on circumpolar stars, the stars that never set, circling the celestial pole through the night. The concept is gentle when described, almost soothing. You watch a star trace its arc, and from that movement you infer the position of the pole, and from the pole you infer true north. But the practice is not gentle at all, because it asks for consistency across nights, for instruments that can hold a line steady, for observers who trust measurement more than intuition. It also asks for a certain kind of mind, not merely a pious mind, but a methodical one, a mind that can accept that the truth is not what the eye feels in the moment, but what the pattern reveals over time. And that brings the story to a smaller, stranger hinge. If the pyramid's alignment was achieved by observing stars, the sky itself becomes a kind of document, a record the builders were reading. But the sky is not fixed in the way it appears. The pole shifts slowly over long spans of time because of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis. Precession is one of those facts that can make the listener's thoughts slow down, not from boredom, but from scale. It means that north, in a stellar sense, drifts across centuries. If you align a building by certain stars in one generation, the same method, repeated centuries later, might produce a slightly different result. And so a new question appears, almost without effort. If different pyramids have slightly different orientation errors, could those errors contain time inside them, like an accidental timestamp? Could the imperfections themselves become evidence, not of failure, but of method? This is where discussion often becomes delicate, because it is easy for modern interpretations to harden into claims that sound more certain than the evidence allows. Some scholars and researchers have suggested that systematic orientation patterns across multiple pyramids might reflect a consistent astronomical technique affected by precession over time. That idea is not the same as saying we know exactly how they did it, and it is not the same as claiming the pyramid is a clock. It is simply a way of noticing that small deviations might not be random, but even noticing that possibility changes the emotional texture of the monument. The pyramid begins to feel less like a single act and more like a product of tradition, a tradition that had rules. And rules imply teachers. Rules imply training. Rules imply that someone cared enough to measure and then cared enough to correct, and then cared enough to pass the correction along. At this point, the mind may want to settle on a comforting thought. Perhaps it was all straightforward, a known method, practiced by skilled Egyptian builders, full stop. The administrative state of Old Kingdom Egypt certainly had the capacity to coordinate complex projects, and documents like Mera's diary show organised transport and scheduling in Khufu's reign. That supports the broader picture of a society capable of sustained large-scale planning, yet the pyramid remains stubbornly uneven in what it reveals. Logistics survive. Engineering explanation does not. And when that gap opens, the listener naturally wonders whether the knowledge was guarded or simply never written down in the first place. A guarded method would fit the psychology of power. Secrets preserve authority. A technique known only to a small group can become a royal asset, something to be controlled rather than shared. And if that were true, it would help explain why the record feels administrative rather than theoretical. But there is another possibility that feels even quieter, and therefore, in a way, more haunting. Perhaps the builders did not think of what they were doing as engineering in the modern sense, and therefore did not think it needed explanation. Perhaps the method was sacred craft, and sacred craft does not always translate itself into manuals. It translates itself into repetition. It translates itself into apprenticeships. It translates itself into stone. Here the Great Pyramid begins to resemble a paradox. It is a monument of public power, visible for miles, yet its most technical achievements are locked inside decisions that are hard to read without modern surveying. It is as if the builders wanted the form to be obvious, but the mind behind the form to remain partially concealed. If that was intentional, there is a reason it would matter. A visible monument can impress the living, but a hidden precision can speak to something else entirely, to the gods, to the cosmos, to a future age, or to an inner priesthood that alone understood what the geometry meant. And when a monument begins to feel as if it has an inner audience, the temptation is to drift toward the dramatic. The temptation is to invent a hidden message so thrilling that the silence becomes proof. That is precisely where trust is lost, and where the mind, ironically, becomes restless rather than curious. So the story stays careful. The alignment can be discussed as a technical accomplishment, rooted in plausible observational practices without implying modern instruments. The administrative framework can be anchored in surviving documents without claiming those documents reveal the full method. And the question can remain open. What kind of society can achieve both practical logistics and near cardinal precision while leaving so little explanatory writing? The Smithsonian has discussed one modern proposal that connects alignment to the fall equinox, suggesting that seasonal solar patterns might have provided a practical reference for establishing cardinal directions. Whether that specific approach can explain the full precision in every case is debated, and it may not stand as a single universal solution. But even the existence of such proposals is revealing, because it shows how many different simple methods have been imagined, and how none of them settles the matter completely. That unsettled feeling is not an enemy of calm, it is a form of calm. The mind relaxes not because everything is resolved, but because the questions have a stable place to rest. If an equinox-based method could work, the pyramid's alignment becomes a triumph of practical observation. If a circumpolar star method was used, it becomes a triumph of patient astronomy. If multiple methods existed, refined through experience, then the pyramid becomes the peak of an evolving tradition. But notice what all of these possibilities share. They all require time. They require waiting. They require repeated observation rather than a single inspired guess. And time, in the Old Kingdom, was not merely a resource, it was a political achievement. A state capable of pausing harvest labour, feeding workers, coordinating transport, and sustaining a multi-year build is a state with extraordinary control. And control invites its own darker question. What happens when control weakens? Later pharaohs over time moved away from pyramids as their primary royal tombs, and explanations often include the practical issue that pyramids were prominent targets for looting, along with shifting religious and political priorities. That change does not need to be framed as a sudden collapse. It can be framed as a slow adaptation to reality. If a pyramid announces where treasure might be found, then secrecy becomes a better strategy than height. But if secrecy becomes the strategy, then the craft changes. The state stops demanding the same kind of public geometry. The builders stop practicing the same kind of alignment at the same scale. The tradition, even if it continues, becomes thinner. So the Great Pyramid begins to look like a peak not only in stone, but in governance. a moment when the state could afford to build something that did not merely serve a function, but performed an idea, order, permanence, cosmic orientation, on a scale that later generations either could not or would not repeat. And this is where the listener may notice that the story is turning, slowly, toward an even tighter focus, because alignment is not only a property of the exterior. Alignment is also a property of the interior, of the way passages maintain angles and directions within a massive body of masonry. The outside can be surveyed by anyone. The inside was meant to be unseen, and yet it holds its own disciplined geometry, as if the same observational mind that watched the sky also watched the line of a corridor in darkness. That is not proof of a secret. It is simply a way of noticing continuity. It suggests that whatever method the builders used, it was not applied only for show. It was applied where no crowd would praise it. And that may be the most unsettling detail of all. A civilization will sometimes exaggerate what it wants others to see. But it is less common for it to exaggerate what it intends no one to see. So the next step is not to widen the story into grand theories. It is to narrow it, to move from how did they orient the pyramid toward why does the interior behave as though orientation mattered inside the stone? Because if the pyramid was only a container, orientation would be a surface concern. But if the pyramid was also a kind of pathway, symbolic, ritual, or conceptual, then the inner angles and directions begin to look like part of the design's language. And when a structure has a language, the question is never only what it says. The question is who it was meant to be heard by. The idea of orientation changes when it moves from the outer faces into the hidden interior. Outside, alignment can be a public statement, something visible, something a priest or a passerby could sense just by watching the sun travel across the day. Inside, alignment becomes private, almost secretive, because the passages were not meant for crowds. They were meant for a few footsteps in darkness. And that raises a different kind of question. What does it mean to keep north inside a sealed mountain of stone? A listener might assume that once a structure is closed, direction no longer matters. In a sealed room, left and right are enough, up and down are enough. But the Great Pyramid seems to preserve direction as if direction itself were part of the function, not merely part of the construction. That is not a claim about a single mechanism or a hidden device. It is simply a way of noticing a mood in the design. The design does not feel casual. It feels disciplined, as though the builders were answering requirements that were not fully visible on the surface. And yet, the surviving documents that are so helpful in understanding the logistics of building do not explain those requirements. Mera's diary, often discussed as evidence for organised transport during Khufu's reign, is administrative and practical in character, which makes it valuable. But it does not read like a guide to internal planning. It tells a story of movement and scheduling, not of why the inside of the pyramid needed to behave as if it had a map. So the mind returns to the same hinge again and again. Perhaps the why was never written down, because the why was not meant to be widely known. Or perhaps the why was so integrated into religious practice that it didn't feel like something separate from the act of building. A society can record what it does, and still keep the deeper logic held close, preserved through controlled teaching rather than open explanation. There is a calmness to that idea, because it does not require the story to become sensational. It does not require outsiders, lost civilizations, or impossible technology. It requires only a familiar human pattern, the separation between public labour and private knowledge. But a familiar pattern can still feel unsettling when it is scaled up to a monument as vast as the Great Pyramid. Imagine, for a moment, the experience of moving through it. The first passages are narrow. They force the body to bow. The stone is close on either side. If the pyramid's outer faces were once luminous in the sun, the interior would have been the opposite, enclosed, absorbing sound, making the smallest movement feel amplified. The body becomes aware of its own presence in a place that was not built for comfort, and then, somewhere within that constrained space, direction becomes a kind of companion, not because there are signs, but because the angles and the straightness of the passages insist on a world of measurement. A corridor can be rough and still be straight. It can be low and still be deliberate. When a line is held accurately through stone, it feels as if someone long ago was refusing to let the structure drift even a fraction from its intended course. Why does that matter? One answer is purely practical. Precision makes construction easier to control. It reduces compounding errors. It ensures that separate teams working in different parts of the monument can meet where they are supposed to meet. That alone could justify a disciplined geometry, and a disciplined geometry would fit a state capable of sustained coordination. But that practical answer creates another small question, softer but more persistent. If the interior precision was only a construction necessity, why does the pyramid still feel like it is saying something through its layout? Why does it feel as if the spaces were composed, not merely assembled? That feeling might be an illusion, a modern mind projecting intention onto stone. Yet it is also possible that the builders wanted the interior to have a kind of order that mirrored the order outside. Here the sky returns. Discussions of the pyramid's orientation often focus on astronomical observation as a way to establish cardinal directions, using stable patterns overhead as a guide for stable lines on Earth. That concept, bringing the sky's order down into architecture, sits naturally beside broader ancient ideas about linking kingship and cosmic regularity, though the specifics can vary and should be held carefully. If the pyramid was meant, in part, to connect the king with a cosmic framework, then direction becomes more than a building choice. It becomes a ritual choice. It becomes the difference between an ordinary chamber and a chamber that participates in a larger invisible map. But this thought cannot be allowed to settle too quickly, because the pyramid resists one clean motive. Every time the mind tries to close around a single explanation, another detail seems to press back. If the interior is ritual, why the sense of misdirection? Why passages that seem to invite confusion? Why a layout that can feel like a deliberate refusal to be easily read? If the interior is defensive, why the care that goes beyond what a simple trap would require? Why the impression of design elegance in spaces that were meant to be sealed away? If the interior is symbolic, why does it also feel like a solution to physical problems, weight, pressure, stability, handled with such confidence that later pyramids seem to abandon that exact approach rather than refine it? That last point matters because it situates the pyramid in a longer historical arc. Over time, pharaohs stopped building pyramids as their primary royal tombs, and commonly cited reasons include vulnerability to looting alongside shifts in religious practice and political priorities. Those shifts do not directly explain the Great Pyramid's inner layout, but they do tell a story about changing strategies, the move from being seen to being hidden. And if later kings moved toward hidden burials, partly because prominent monuments drew intruders, then the Great Pyramid becomes a kind of early, loud experiment, an experiment that made the problem visible. The pyramid announces itself, and in doing so, it also announces the challenge of keeping anything inside it safe. That, too, might have shaped the interior. A monument that is meant to be seen could still be designed as a psychological labyrinth. It could be built with the expectation that someone, someday, would come looking, not because the builders wanted the intrusion, but because they understood human behaviour well enough to predict it. This is where the mental footstep returns quietly. If the builders anticipated intrusion, then the interior might contain not only sacred pathways, but false pathways, not only access, but narrative, a story told in corridors. This way is obvious, that way is harder. This chamber looks promising, that one looks unfinished. This route leads deeper. This one shifts the traveller into uncertainty. But that creates another problem. A decoy is most effective when it looks like the real thing. A false destination must feel convincing. That means the builders would have needed to know what an intruder expects to find. They would have needed to design not only a monument, but an expectation. So what would an intruder expect? A burial chamber, a treasure, a sealed space at the centre, a place where the prize is obvious. And what does the Great Pyramid offer instead? A sense of displacement. A chamber that can feel strangely plain for something so monumental. An interior that does not immediately reveal its logic. An experience that keeps the visitor, ancient or modern, slightly unsure of what is essential and what is incidental. Even if one never goes inside, that uncertainty radiates outward because it affects how the whole story is told. This is why certain modern discoveries, even when they are not final answers, capture the public imagination. Not because they prove an extraordinary alternative history, but because they remind everyone that the monument still contains unanswered questions. But the narrative must remain careful and honest here. Curiosity does not require exaggeration. It requires restraint. The known evidence supports a picture of Old Kingdom Egypt capable of major organisation and sustained building programs, with Meres' diary often cited as part of the documentation for labour and transport linked to Khufu's projects. The pyramid's impressive alignment is widely discussed in the context of plausible astronomical methods available to ancient observers, and the later historical shift away from pyramids as primary royal tombs is commonly explained through factors like looting risk and changing priorities. Those are solid stones to stand on. And yet, when those stones are set together, they do not create a smooth, complete floor. They create a gap in the middle, because they describe capacity without fully describing knowledge. They show that the state could move materials. They show that the builders could aim a monument toward cardinal directions with striking accuracy. They show that later rulers changed burial strategies over time, but they do not give a surviving text that says plainly, this is what the internal plan meant. So the interior remains, as it has always been, a kind of withheld explanation. And perhaps that is where the listener's mind should rest for a moment, not on what the pyramid is, but on what it does to the thinking mind. It creates a steady rhythm of almost answers. The logistics are there, but not the full theory. The alignment is there, but not a single uncontested method. The historical arc is there, but not a neat progression of improvement. The monument stands at the centre of all three, like a problem that can be approached from multiple angles without ever being fully solved. And that leads naturally to the next narrowing. The story cannot stay on the broad question of, were the pyramids built by the Egyptians? Because the evidence for Egyptian state involvement and Old Kingdom context is substantial, even if some details remain debated. The more interesting, more honest question becomes, what kind of Egyptian society produced this? What kind of training? What kind of guarded expertise? What kind of collaboration between administrative planners and specialised builders? In other words, the mystery is no longer only about who built it. It is about how knowledge can exist inside a civilization without leaving the kind of footprint modern people expect. Because when knowledge leaves no clear manual, the monument becomes the manual, not in sentences, in angles, in decisions, in the discipline of lines held steady through stone. And the next place to look, very quietly, is not at the Great Pyramid alone, but at the pattern around it, at what happens when a civilization tries to repeat a masterpiece and the repetition comes out subtly changed, because changes, even small ones, can reveal what the builders did not fully control, and what they did not fully control may be the most important clue of all. To see what a civilization truly understands, it helps to watch what happens when it tries to repeat itself. A single masterpiece can be explained away as luck, or as a rare combination of talent and circumstance. But repetition is different. Repetition is where methods reveal themselves. If the method is solid, the second and third attempts tend to stabilize, even if the scale changes. The line may soften, the finish may vary, but the underlying competence remains. And when competence does not remain, the absence has a shape. After the Great Pyramid, Egypt continued to build pyramids for generations, but the later story is often described as a gradual move away from pyramid building as the primary royal burial strategy, influenced by factors like cost, vulnerability to looting, and changing religious and political priorities. That broad arc is not controversial in itself. What is more quietly unsettling is the feeling that, even before the full shift away occurred, something about the pyramid mind had already begun to thin. This is where it becomes tempting to talk about decline as if it were a single event. But decline is rarely a single event. It is often a series of small substitutions that seem reasonable at the time. A slightly different stone because it is easier to quarry, a slightly different core because it is faster to build, a slightly different casing because the supply lines are strained, a slightly different workforce because the old crews have been reassigned. Each substitution can be defended, each can be explained, and yet when many substitutions stack together, the result is not merely smaller, it is something else entirely. So the question becomes quieter and sharper. What was substituted in the generations after Giza? Not only stone, not only labour, not only money. What was substituted in the invisible world of knowledge? It helps here to hold in mind the strange contrasts that surviving evidence can create. Some of the documents that speak most clearly to pyramid building are not mystical texts. They are administrative notes, schedules, and records of transport, such as the diary associated with Merer that is often discussed in relation to Khufu's building projects. That kind of document is a window into capability. It suggests that officials could coordinate boats, crews, routes, and timing with enough discipline to keep materials moving steadily. But administrative capacity is not the same as design genius. A society can move stone without knowing the deepest theory of why a particular structural choice works. A society can be highly organised and still be dependent on a small number of specialists for its most delicate decisions. And this is where the story becomes almost intimate, because it asks the listener to imagine a few individuals whose names may not survive, whose methods may not have been recorded in the way modern minds expect, and whose absence could be felt decades later without anyone ever writing a sentence that admits it. If that sounds too fragile to be true, it helps to remember how fragile certain kinds of expertise can be. An apprentice does not learn a craft in one season. It takes years of repetition, of correction, of watching someone else's hands. If that chain of teaching is broken by politics, by famine, by a shift in royal priorities, the loss is not announced, it is simply lived. The next generation builds something that looks similar from a distance, but behaves differently up close, and the pyramids, especially the ones that followed, can feel like this kind of distance-based imitation, the form preserved, the inner certainty reduced. Here another detail returns softly, like a refrain. The Great Pyramid's near cardinal alignment is widely discussed as a striking achievement, with plausible explanations rooted in careful astronomical observation and the use of celestial patterns as reference. That matters because it reminds the listener that some aspects of pyramid construction did not depend on hidden machines or impossible tools. They depended on patience and method. But patience is not a universal resource. Patience depends on stability. It depends on a state that can afford to wait for clear skies, to train observers, to repeat measurements, to accept delays. So when later building programs appear, in many cases, less exact or less enduring, it is reasonable to wonder whether it reflects not a sudden disappearance of intelligence, but a subtle shift in the conditions that make precision possible. And that leads to another question, one that is almost uncomfortable because it feels too human. Did the builders of the Great Pyramid know they were creating something that could not easily be repeated? Not because they were hiding a secret from the world, but because they could feel in their own lives how narrow the path to that level of discipline really was. If a method requires repeated observation of the sky, small errors corrected through long experience, then it becomes dependent on continuity. Continuity is a fragile thing. A single generation of upheaval can be enough to bend a line that was once straight. And the Old Kingdom did not exist in a vacuum of calm perfection. States have pressures, administrations shift, royal projects compete with one another, religious priorities evolve. Even if the broad reasons for moving away from pyramids came later, the conditions that sustained the highest precision might have begun changing earlier. But that creates another problem. Because if the Great Pyramid was a peak of method, there should be signs of the method's growth leading up to it and signs of its careful practice afterward. The growth exists, to a point, in the broader archaeological narrative. The signs afterward are harder to interpret, not because nothing was built, but because what was built does not feel like a straightforward continuation of the same internal confidence. So perhaps the honest way to hold it is this. It may not be that the Egyptians forgot how to build. It may be that the particular concentration of resources, expertise, and centralised will that produced the Great Pyramid was rare. Even within their own long history, a single reign can sometimes do what a century cannot. A single patron can make a craft bloom, and then, when that patron is gone, the craft shrinks back into something more ordinary. This is a quiet explanation, and it is also the kind that modern listeners often resist, because it does not offer a thrilling resolution. It offers something more unsettling. The idea that greatness can be contingent. But the Great Pyramid continues to resist being reduced to contingency alone, because some parts of it feel less like maximum effort and more like specific intention. A state can throw labour at a monument and still not achieve certain kinds of precision without a coherent plan. A state can demand scale and still fail at subtlety. And yet, the pyramid's overall effect is not merely scale, it is coherence. And coherence raises the possibility that there were principles at work, principles that could not simply be reproduced by throwing more bodies at the problem. At this point, the mind naturally tries to locate those principles somewhere concrete. Were they mathematical? Were they astronomical? Were they structural? Were they ritual? The danger is to choose too quickly, because the moment a listener decides it must have been astronomy, a new question appears. If it was astronomy, why is the method not clearly preserved in surviving texts? Especially when some administrative documents do survive. And the moment the listener decides it must have been ritual, another question appears. If it was ritual, why does it manifest so strongly as engineering discipline? And the moment the listener decides it must have been purely engineering, the sky returns, tugging gently at the mind, reminding it that the exterior alignment is not a random outcome of stacking stones, but a deliberate relationship to the cardinal directions, plausibly found through astronomical observation. So perhaps the principle is not a single one. Perhaps the pyramid exists at the intersection of different kinds of knowledge, each held by different people. The administrators who could keep stone moving, the specialists who could set lines, the foremen who could manage crews, the religious authorities who shaped the symbolic requirements. If that is true, the Great Pyramid becomes less like a solitary miracle and more like a rare convergence, an alignment not only of stone, but of institutions. And institutions, like stars, shift. When they shift, the structure of knowledge can drift even if the culture remains. This is also why the later shift away from pyramids matters psychologically, not merely historically. Discussions of why pharaohs stopped building pyramids often include the fact that pyramids were conspicuous targets for looting, along with changes in religious and political priorities. If later kings concluded that visibility was a liability, then the entire logic of monumental burial architecture begins to invert. A pyramid says, here is the king, here is permanence, here is a claim that will outlast generations. A hidden burial says, here is the king, but you will not find him. If the culture gradually moves toward hidden strategies, then the motivation to perfect public geometry weakens. The craft that once served public order becomes less valued, less funded, less practiced at the same scale. And then, without anyone ever declaring it, the most delicate expertise becomes a kind of antique knowledge, respected perhaps, but no longer required. This would explain something that otherwise feels strange. The Great Pyramid stands as if it is speaking to eternity. But later, choices suggest a world in which eternity had to compete with very practical threats. And when practical threats win, architectural philosophy changes. Yet, there is one more layer here, and it is the layer that refuses to let the mind rest. Because even if looting risk and changing priorities help explain the eventual move away from pyramids, they do not explain why a society would invest in such a complex internal design in the first place, if the risk was always there. The risk of intrusion is obvious the moment a monument rises. So why choose the pyramid strategy at all? That question implies that the builders were prioritizing something else, something that outweighed the risk. Perhaps they believed the monument's symbolic power was itself protective. Perhaps they believed the architecture could confuse intruders, turning stone into misdirection. Perhaps they believed that what mattered most was not the physical security of an object inside, but the performance of cosmic order outside. None of these are claims that can be proven in a single stroke, but the act of holding them side by side changes the way the later decline is felt. It is no longer only a story of they stopped building pyramids. It becomes a story of a civilization slowly renegotiating what it believed architecture could accomplish. And that renegotiation leaves traces, not always in texts, sometimes in the quality of stonework, sometimes in the choice of location, sometimes in the willingness to accept approximation where once there was insistence on precision. So the pattern around the Great Pyramid begins to look less like a simple arc of improvement or decline, and more like a map of shifting values. Values determine what knowledge is protected. Values determine what knowledge is written down. Values determine what knowledge is allowed to disappear, which returns us again to the silence. Mera's diary shows a world that could record logistics with clarity and routine precision. The alignment discussions show a world that could orient monuments through careful celestial observation without needing modern devices. The later shift away from pyramids shows a world responding to real pressures, changing strategies, adapting over time. And still, the Great Pyramid remains at the centre, like a sentence missing its verb, a monument that proves competence but does not fully reveal its mind. In the next segment, the focus will tighten further onto the idea of imitation, because imitation is where secrets accidentally show themselves. When later builders try to recreate an older masterpiece, they often keep what they understand and discard what they do not. And what they discard is rarely random. It points quietly toward the parts of the method that were hardest to hold. Imitation is often described as flattery, but in history it can be something else. It can be a diagnostic. When a civilization tries to repeat a masterpiece, the repetition shows what was truly understood and what was only admired from a distance. The second version reveals which parts were essential, which were optional, and which were never fully grasped in the first place. There is a reason this matters at Giza. The Great Pyramid sits inside an old kingdom world that clearly knew how to organise immense labour and long supply chains, and the diary associated with Merer is often discussed precisely because it captures that organised movement of materials in Khufu's time in an unromantic, administrative voice. It shows competence in scheduling and transport, the kind that makes a massive building programme possible without requiring any supernatural leap. And yet, even with that kind of competence on display, the deeper logic of the monument still feels oddly unspoken. So the mind turns to the generations that followed, not because later kings were weaker or less intelligent, or less capable of commanding workers, but because their choices become a kind of shadow text, a record written in what they kept, what they changed, and what they quietly let go. The broad arc, as many overviews explain, is that Egypt eventually moved away from pyramids as the main royal tomb type, with explanations often pointing to practical vulnerabilities like looting, and to shifts in religious and political priorities. That doesn't automatically mean the craft vanished overnight. It suggests something more gradual and more human, a slow recalculation of what monumental architecture could achieve and what it could not. But even gradual shifts leave fingerprints. A ruler does not need to abandon a tradition completely in order for a tradition to begin losing its sharpest edge. Sometimes the first thing to disappear is not the form, but the obsession, the demand for almost unbearable accuracy, the insistence that a line must be held, not because close enough would fail structurally, but because the line itself has become part of what the monument is. This is why the Great Pyramid's orientation remains so psychologically powerful. It encourages the modern mind to imagine careful astronomical work, because discussions of the pyramid's alignment so often return to sky-based methods using celestial observation to establish cardinal directions with high precision. Some proposals look toward circumpolar stars as stable references, others toward solar patterns at specific times of year, such as ideas discussed in mainstream science, writing about equinox-related alignment hypotheses. Not all of these ideas can be simultaneously correct in their details, and debate persists about method and exactness. But the underlying point is difficult to escape. The pyramid's alignment invites the sky into the story. Now imagine what it means to imitate something like that. It is one thing to imitate a silhouette. A pyramid's outline is easy to recognise. It is another thing to imitate an orientation practice, because orientation is invisible unless you measure it. You can replicate the look of a monument and still drift slightly in the lines that no crowd notices. And if a later ruler's priorities are changing, if security, speed, or symbolism begins to matter more than a particular kind of precision, then the invisible practices are the first to thin out, because they cost time and require training. This is the quiet trap of imitation. It can preserve what the eye wants and lose what the method requires. And here another question slides in, almost gently. If the Great Pyramid represents a peak of technique, was that technique widely distributed or was it concentrated? The diary associated with Merer, again, offers a clue without offering an answer. It suggests that at least some knowledge was administrative and widely usable. Dates, work crews, transport routines, a system that could be written down and handed over. That kind of knowledge scales well. It can survive the loss of a few individuals because it is recorded and repeatable. But the kind of knowledge that turns observation into near cardinal orientation is different. Even if the method is conceptually simple, it asks for practiced eyes, stable instruments, and repeated correction. Which kind of knowledge is more fragile? Usually it is the knowledge that lives in practice rather than in text. And this is where the mind begins to suspect that imitation in Egypt may not have meant what it means today. It may not have meant copying a design from paper. It may have meant building from memory, building from precedent, building from a sacred template that was never fully exposed in writing. The later builders could have been capable, sincere, and industrious, while still standing at a slight distance from the original conceptual core. If so, a later pyramid could look correct and still be subtly wrong, not in the sense of bad, but in the sense of not governed by the same inner rules. That thought is easy to romanticize, so it has to remain cautious. There is no need to claim a hidden civilization, or missing technology, or secret outsiders. The evidence that survives can support something more ordinary and, in a way, more unsettling. A complex state project where some crucial expertise may have been specialized, guarded, or transmitted through channels that did not leave many surviving textual traces. And if that was true, it creates a new kind of mystery that is quieter than the usual headline question of who built what. It becomes a mystery about how knowledge is stored. Modern minds trust documents. They trust the written page. Ancient societies often trusted living chains, apprenticeship, ritual performance, embodied craft. If you want to protect something, you can put it on papyrus and hope time is kind, or you can put it into a tradition and hope society is stable. The Great Pyramid makes the listener wonder which kind of protection its builders chose, because strangely, the most paper-like evidence we have, records of moving stone, survives in discussion precisely because it was not trying to be eternal. It was routine. It was administrative. It had no reason to be guarded as sacred. And yet, it survived at least in part when the deeper why did not. So what was the why if it existed? A tomb is the standard answer. But even that word can be misleading, because Egyptian royal burial culture was not only about hiding a body, it was also about connecting kingship to cosmic order, and cosmic order naturally pulls orientation and sky watching into the same gravitational field. That connection doesn't require exotic theories. It requires only the recognition that monuments can do more than one thing at once: protect, proclaim, and perform meaning. But then comes another quiet question, more personal than technical. If the pyramid was meant to perform meaning, for whom? For the living, who saw it and understood the king's power? For the priest, who may have understood a deeper cosmological scheme? For the king himself, conceived as a figure moving into an afterlife mapped in stars, or for a future that the builders could not name, but could anticipate in the simplest possible way, that the monument would outlast them, and that some later eyes would look at it and ask how it was done? This last possibility is not a claim. It is simply a recognition that builders of lasting monuments often think in generations. The Great Pyramid's scale almost forces that kind of thinking. And if the builders thought in generations, then they might also have thought about imitation. They might have known that others would try to repeat it. Now the story begins to tighten toward a very specific tension. the difference between doing and explaining. Mera's diary is often discussed as showing doing, stone moved, schedules kept, crews organised. Alignment discussions often focus on doing as well, careful observation used to establish a direction. But explanation is something else. Explanation is what turns a craft into a system that can survive disruption. Explanation is what turns a tradition into a transferable method. If the explanation was never written, then imitation becomes inevitable. Later generations can repeat the visible form while losing the invisible reasoning. They inherit the answer, but not the equation. And then a civilization can appear to decline, even as it continues working hard, because the work has shifted from invention to reverent repetition. This is also where the later shift away from pyramids becomes more than an endnote. When overviews discuss why pharaohs stopped building pyramids, the reasons frequently include that pyramids were prominent targets for looting and that religious and political priorities changed. That shift tells the listener something about incentive. If the state no longer sees the pyramid as the best solution, if it becomes a liability, an invitation, then the state will stop investing in the most expensive and delicate parts of the craft. And when a craft loses investment, it does not always vanish dramatically. It becomes thinner. It becomes less confident. It becomes something that can still produce monuments, but not quite the same monuments. So perhaps the most revealing thing about imitation is not that later pyramids were different, but that the civilization eventually chose to stop imitating at all. It chose other strategies, other architectures, other ways of concealing the king's resting place from human hunger. And that decision, even if practical, hints at a deeper resignation. That visibility was no longer worth the cost, yet there is still a remaining discomfort, and it is important not to smooth it away. Even if looting risk helps explain why later rulers preferred hidden burials, it does not fully explain why the Great Pyramid was built with such a sense of deliberate order in the first place. The risk was never truly absent. A monument that can be seen can also be found. So why commit to a strategy that seems, from one angle, almost to invite the future to interfere? That question presses the mind toward the interior again. Because if you cannot make the monument invisible, you can still make it unreadable. You can still make it psychologically difficult to solve. A thief can find stone, but not necessarily understand it. And this is where imitation becomes a kind of confession. If later builders imitated only the outer form, perhaps they believed the outer form was the core. If later builders changed internal practices, perhaps those practices were not widely understood, or not widely valued, or not widely preserved. It is also possible, quietly possible, that the Great Pyramid's builders themselves did not want the method to spread. A method can be power. Power can be controlled. And the simplest way to control something is not to write it down. That thought does not accuse anyone of conspiracy. It simply recognizes that secrecy is a normal human behavior, and especially normal in worlds where authority is sacred. So the narrative reaches a point where the mystery is no longer only historical, but almost anatomical. It is about where knowledge lived inside Old Kingdom Egypt, in the state's paperwork, in the builder's hands, in the priest's rituals, or in the monument itself. And if the monument itself became the storage vessel, if the pyramid became a kind of silent archive, then imitation would always be partial, because later generations could measure the result without inheriting the original conceptual language. In the next segment, the focus will narrow again, away from pyramids in general and toward the small, telling decisions that imitators tend to miss. The decisions that look unnecessary until you know what they are protecting, or what they are guiding, or what they are quietly refusing to reveal. There is a particular kind of detail that rarely makes it into schoolbook history because it does not look dramatic at first glance. It is not a battle. It is not a king's name carved into stone. It is not even a discovery. It is a choice. A small decision made during construction that only becomes visible when another generation tries to repeat it and does something slightly different. Those are the decisions that tend to reveal where knowledge truly lived. A monument as large as the Great Pyramid forces the mind to imagine power, the power to command labour, to gather resources, to sustain years of work. And that image is not wrong. The surviving administrative perspective, the kind represented by documents like the diary associated with Mera, suggests an Egypt capable of organising transport and routine scheduling at scale. But administration, no matter how capable, is not the same thing as insight. Administration moves what already exists. Insight decides what must exist. So when later builders reproduce the silhouette, what they may be reproducing is the part of the pyramid that administration can deliver. Mass, continuity, repetition. What is harder to reproduce is the part that depends on fewer minds, quieter minds, minds trained to feel when an angle is wrong before the error becomes visible. This is where the phrase small telling decisions begins to matter, because those decisions sit below the level of public explanation. If a later ruler wanted a pyramid, the request would not be, "Give me the inner logic." The request would be, "Give me a pyramid." And when that request travels down through officials, budgets, deadlines and politics, it changes shape. It becomes simpler, more measurable, and therefore more manageable. It becomes a set of requirements that can be checked, a base of a certain size, a height that can be announced, a monument that can be seen from afar. But the Great Pyramid does not feel like it was built primarily for announcement. Yes, it announces, it dominates, it insists on itself, yet some part of it feels composed, almost like a piece of music that would sound wrong if a single note were moved. That kind of cohesion does not happen by accident, and it does not happen simply because a state is powerful. It happens because someone cares about relationships between spaces, between alignments, between interior roots and exterior faces. And relationships are hard to preserve when the reasons for them are not written down. This is why the absence of a clear engineering manual has such force in the imagination. The documentary mind wants a text that speaks in the modern tone. We did this, therefore we did that, and here is why. But the strongest evidence that survives from the Old Kingdom world is often administrative rather than explanatory, and that includes material like Mera's diary, which is valuable precisely because it records routine work rather than mythic certainty. It shows that action could be recorded. It does not show that reasoning was recorded in the same way. This does not prove that reasoning was absent. It suggests something subtler, that reasoning may have been stored elsewhere, in living chains, in apprenticeships, in sacred restrictions, in guild-like circles where knowledge was a kind of inheritance, not a public resource. It is not hard to imagine how such a system could produce a masterpiece, and then, without anyone intending it, produce weaker echoes afterward, because a living chain depends on continuity, and continuity depends on conditions that are not always stable: political stability, economic stability, the stability of patronage, the stability of a cultural decision that this kind of building is still worth doing at the highest level. When those conditions shift, what disappears first is not the visible form. What disappears first is the quiet insistence on perfection. This is where a listener may feel a change in the emotional temperature of the story, not because there is drama, but because there is vulnerability. It is unsettling to think that the greatest monuments can depend on fragile human threads, and when those threads fray, The fraying may be visible not in collapse, but in compromise. A compromise is easy to justify in the moment. A compromise can even be wise, but compromises accumulate. They become a second tradition, a tradition of good enough, layered on top of a tradition of exact. Here the Great Pyramid's alignment returns like a steady star in the narrative sky. Discussions of its near-cardinal orientation often emphasize that plausible methods exist that rely on careful observation of celestial patterns. Whether those methods involve circumpolar stars, solar observations, or other approaches proposed in modern writing, the underlying idea is the same. The sky can function as a stable reference for establishing direction, even without modern instruments. That matters because it shows something important about the nature of the pyramid's precision. It does not require magic. It requires patience. And patience is a resource. It is as real as stone. If a later ruler, is under pressure to build faster, to redirect labour, to respond to instability, to satisfy a changing religious culture, patience becomes expensive. The sky still holds its patterns, but the state may no longer be willing to pay for the nights of waiting and repetition that transform pattern into line. So the small decisions begin to look less like technical details and more like choices about time. Do you wait until the sky gives you confidence, or do you accept a line that seems straight enough? Do you train specialists for years, or do you rely on what the workforce already knows? Do you treat the monument as a performance of cosmic order, or as a political object with practical vulnerabilities? This last question begins to matter more as history moves forward. Over time, Egypt's royal burial strategy shifted, and explanations often include practical concerns such as the vulnerability of pyramids to looting, along with changes in religious and political priorities. A pyramid is visible, and visibility attracts attention. Even without imagining a dramatic crisis, it is easy to see how a culture could slowly decide that secrecy is safer than splendour. But notice what that implies. If the culture decides that secrecy is safer, then the culture changes what it rewards. It stops rewarding the craft of public geometry at the grandest scale. It begins rewarding other skills: concealment, complexity of hidden routes, placement in remote valleys, perhaps even the creation of sacred misdirection. A craft that is not rewarded does not always disappear. It becomes marginal. It becomes something remembered rather than practiced. It becomes something that can still be imitated in outline, but not maintained in depth. So when the narrative says later pyramids were different, the deeper meaning may be later Egypt was asking monuments to do something different. A pyramid is an argument for permanence. It says, a king's order is as stable as stone, as stable as the horizon. It is, in a sense, a refusal to accept decay. A hidden tomb, by contrast, accepts a certain realism about human behaviour. It says the world is dangerous, and the best defence is invisibility. Both statements can be religious, both can be political, but they reward different kinds of knowledge. And once that shift begins, imitation becomes strained. Builders can repeat the old language, but fewer people may still remember how to speak it fluently. This is where the story can move from the external question of who built the pyramids to the internal question of how knowledge moved inside Egypt. Mera's diary suggests that administrative knowledge could be written and preserved in some form, at least in fragments that survive to the present, but the methods proposed for achieving high precision alignment suggest another kind of knowledge, observational, practiced, and dependent on repeated verification. And the later shift away from pyramids suggests that the state's priorities changed in ways that could reduce the demand for that particular kind of practiced precision. Put those three stones together and the mind begins to see the gap between doing and understanding. A society can keep doing something after it stops fully understanding why the original version worked so well. It can preserve the outer ritual while losing the inner theory. It can keep the habit and lose the reason. This is not an insult to later builders. It is not even rare. It happens in many cultures. It happens whenever knowledge is carried primarily by living chains rather than by explicit documentation. It happens whenever a craft is embedded in social structures that can change faster than stone can weather. And the Great Pyramid, standing so steadily in the background, becomes a kind of mirror held up to this process. It is not only a monument to a king, it is a monument to a moment when multiple kinds of knowledge, administrative, organisation, practiced observation, disciplined geometry, were aligned in the same direction. But alignment in human affairs is never permanent. It drifts. It can drift slowly enough that the people living through it do not notice. They still build. They still honour. They still name their projects with confidence. Yet the inner quality changes, and future observers sense the difference without always being able to name what caused it. That sense, the sense of something changing without anyone announcing it, is one of the quiet engines of this mystery, because it keeps the listener curious without forcing the story into exaggeration. It invites a patient kind of attention, not to spectacular claims, but to subtle shifts. So the next question is not, what was the secret technology? The next question is gentler, and it is more difficult to answer. If there was a core of method behind the Great Pyramid's coherence, where would it have been kept and how would it have been protected? If it was protected through writing, it might have left traces in the kind of documentation that survives in administrative fragments, yet the most famous surviving fragments point to logistics rather than theory. If it was protected through tradition, then it could be extremely precise and still leave little behind except the finished object. If it was protected through priesthood, then the method might have been intertwined with ritual language rather than separated into technical explanation. And if it was protected simply through practice, through the repeated doing of a thing, then the method could be lost when the doing stopped being demanded at the same level. All of these possibilities lead to the same quiet implication. The Great Pyramid may not be an unsolved mystery because the evidence is hidden. It may be unsolved because the evidence is not the kind modern minds are trained to recognize. A monument can be the residue of intelligence without containing a readable statement of that intelligence. It can be a solution that outlives the people who knew how to derive it. And if that is true, then imitation is not merely a later failure. It is a clue. It tells us which parts of the original were easier to carry forward and which parts were too delicate, too dependent on a chain of teaching that could break without leaving a dramatic crack in history. In the next segment, the attention will narrow to the feeling of delicate parts themselves, those aspects of a tradition that can survive in stone as a result, but not survive in society as a method. Because when a civilization loses a method, it does not always lose the desire for the result. It keeps reaching for the result, and each reaching leaves a trace. There is one final place where the silence of the Great Pyramid feels heaviest. It is not in the corridors. It is not in the empty sarcophagus. It is in the cultural memory of the Egyptians themselves, because if you listen carefully to the stories they told centuries later, you begin to notice a strange distance, as if they were looking back at the fourth dynasty, not as a simple past, but as a separate age. By the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after Khufu, the pyramids at Giza were already ancient. They were tourism sites. Visitors left graffiti. Princes came to hunt lions near the Sphinx. And scribes wrote stories about the builders. but the stories had drifted into legend. They spoke of magicians who could part waters. They spoke of secret chambers of Thoth. They spoke of Khufu searching for ancient knowledge rather than inventing it. This drift into myth is normal for any culture looking back across a millennium, but it suggests something important. The specific technical reality of how the Great Pyramid was conceived had already blurred. The Egyptians revered the monument, but they no longer spoke of it with the crisp, dry precision of engineers. They spoke of it with the reverence of inheritors. And this brings us back to the idea of the inventory stele, the controversial artifact found near the pyramid. Whether it is a genuine record or a later pious fiction, its existence points to a psychological truth. Later generations felt a need to frame the Giza plateau as a sacred landscape that predated Khufu, a place where he was a participant, not just a creator. They wanted the site to have deep roots, roots that went down into the time of the gods. That desire to connect the pyramid to a time before is not just ancient superstition. It is a way of acknowledging that the structure feels like it belongs to a different order of capability. It feels like a legacy. So, were the pyramids truly built by the Egyptians? The physical evidence says yes. The quarries are there. The workers' villages are there. The Diary of Mera shows the administrative machinery of the state in action. The alignment fits within a tradition of sky watching that belongs to the culture. The decline fits a historical arc of changing priorities and practical constraints. But built by can mean many things. It can mean built by a workforce we understand, guided by a design we do not. It can mean built by a civilization that possessed a specific concentrated genius that flourished for a moment, and then, like many golden ages, quietly receded. It can mean built by people who saw themselves not as inventors, but as keepers of a sacred measurement. The mystery does not require aliens. It does not require lost continents. It requires only that we accept a simple, uncomfortable fact about human history. Knowledge is not a straight line. It rises, it peaks, it creates miracles of stone. And then, sometimes it softens, it gets forgotten, it gets turned into story. The Great Pyramid stands as a marker of what is possible when a civilization aligns its entire will, its administration, its astronomy, its craft, its belief, toward a single, impossible point. That alignment is rare, it is fragile, and when it breaks, it leaves behind mountains that the future can measure, but perhaps never fully explain. Tonight, as the shadows settle, the pyramid remains what it has always been, a question mark on the horizon, a shape that invites us to look closer, to listen to the silence, and to wonder what else might be waiting in the quiet dark of the past. Sleep well.